今までお世話になりました。
全部で3万くらいっすね。
全部下ろします。
Your Name is a Japanese animated film that follows Mitsuha, who lives in a quiet rural town, and Taki, a high schooler in busy Tokyo. The movie was written and directed by Makoto Shinkai and produced by Comics Wave Films. Your Name was released in 2016 and quickly became one of the highest grossing anime of all time. The story is followed by two teenagers, Mitsuha, a girl from a quiet rural town, and Taki, a high school student in Tokyo. They mysteriously begin switching bodies when they were asleep. As they navigate living each other's lives through messages and notes, they form a deep connection despite never meeting in person. A Silent Voice directed by Naoko Yamada and released in 2016, based on the manga by Yokoshitori Miyoima. The anime centers on Soya Ishida, a boy who bullied a deaf classmate, Soko Nishimiya, in elementary schools. Years later, isolated by his peers and consumed by guilt, Soya's attempts to connect with Soko's in hopes of amending their relationships. Now, as the two struggles to communicate through sign languages, written notes, and hesitant conversations, they are forced to confront not only their shared past, but also the emotional scars that it left behind on their friends, families, and their own sense of self. In Your Name and A Silent Voice, spoken language is often impossible, forcing both films to replace speech with a visual forms of communication such as notes, text, gestures, and sign language. This substitute works only temporarily and breaks down at the most crucial moments. In Your Name, the character depends on written notes and phone reminders to communicate across times. But when this system fails, emotional memories becomes the only connections that continues across timelines. In A Silent Voice, character relies on sign language, notebooks, and visual symbols like the X marks on people's faces. But this also fails until communications becomes possible through visual recognitions when characters are finally seeing and acknowledge one another without any avoidance. Almost all movie treats communication as the primary ways that the characters connect. Your Name and A Silent Voice challenge those assumptions by placing the characters in a world where methods of communications cannot be trusted. All communications is physically impossible, so instead communications unfold through writing, gestures, and memories. To understand how these films imagine the connections beyond spoken language. This comparison is guided by the following questions. Both films tackles the difficulty of communicating when you can't speak to one another, either because you are on the different timelines or because you are physically unable to. What alternative methods of communications do the film explore? Each film has a failed temporary mode of communication that fails. So, what is the more durable options that each film proposes? Although Your Names and A Silent Voice tells of very different stories, they both ask the same questions. What happens when characters cannot rely on spoken language? In both films, communication breaks down, forcing the character to depend on visual alternatives such as notes, phone, gestures, and sign languages, and even symbolic objects. This shared moments reveals how each film uses memories, silence, and visual cues to express feelings that speech cannot carry. So in this video essays, I will examine how Your Name and A Silent Voice visualize communications when spoken words fails. Rather than retelling the plot points, I will focus on how each films use visual language such as cameras, angles, lightings, framing, and sound designs, and also specific objects like the notebooks and phones to express emotions and connections. By analyzing 4 key scenes from each film, we will see how both directors build alternative communication systems where they break down and what more lasting forms of connections when each film ultimately proposes. So, to understand how Your Name and A Silent Voice replace spoken language with visual communications, this video essays will move through 4 stages of breakdown and repair. First, I will examine written communications as a substitute for speech, focusing on the body swaps notes in Your Names and Soko's notebooks during the bullying scenes in The Silent Voice. This moment shows how writing creates a temporary connections but fails when it is ignored or disrespected. Next, I will look at the miscommunication caused by the distance and misunderstandings, comparing Taki's discovery of Itomori's destructions with Soko's failed bridged love confessions. In both cases, words and technology exist, but communication breaks down because the characters cannot properly receive or interpret the meaning. I would then analyze the moments of crisis where communication fails during life or death situations. The twilight meetings in Your Names and the firework scenes in The Silent Voice shows how speech and writing collapse at the critical moments, forcing the characters to act through memories, instinct, and emotion rather than language. I will end by focusing on the recognitions without speech, by comparing the final staircase scenes in Your Name and the school festival scenes in The Silent Voice. In these moments, words are no longer needed. What matters is seeing the other persons being presented. Looking across these scenes, the video argues that Your Name treats memories as a connections that survives times and distance, while A Silent Voice shows that true connections begins when the character stops avoiding others and finally see them clearly. The first way that Your Name replaces spoken language is through writing. During Taki's and Mitsuha's body swap sequence, Mitsuha and Taki left instructions for one another using phone memos and handwritten notes. These messages function as a temporary substitute for dialogues between two people who are never present in the same timelines. Visually, the film highlights writing by placing the text directly on the screens. The close-up shots of the phone memos and the handwritten notes makes the audience read along with the characters. The camera then cuts from the rules that the characters live for one another to Taki's and Mitsuha's actual behaviors, this is setting up a clear contrast between what it is written and what is done. These written rules are repeatedly failed. Taki tells Mitsuha not to spend money. Mitsuha ignores him and spends money on the cafe. When they both give instructions about behaviors, they both break them. This failure is important because the scene shows that writing can only create connections if both people respect and respond to it. Even though that the notes allows Mitsuha and Taki to communicate across times, they cannot fully control or understand each other through writing alone. In Your Name, writing works as a temporary bridge. It is fragile. The film suggests that written communications can only connect people across distance and timelines, yet it cannot guarantee that both parties will respect each other or show understanding. In these scenes, Your Name shows the limit of technology and written communications. After losing contact with Mitsuha, Taki travels to Itomori expecting to find her. Instead, he discovers that the town was destroyed 3 years earlier and that Mitsuha has already died. Up to this point, Taki relies on messages to prove that Mitsuha exists. However, none of this technology works anymore. His phone contains no messages. The histories are gone. The technologies that he once used to communicate across times and distance completely fails. Visually, the film emphasizes this breakthrough through a wide shots of the crater where Itomori once stood. The camera slowly pulls back, placing Taki surrounded by empty spaces. The sounds become quiet, with the music fading into the background. The choices that the film made is to highlight the isolations and the distance rather than connections. Even though that the only evidence to prove that Mitsuha exists is gone, Taki still remembers her. He knows that something important is missing. This moment shows that communication does not fully disappear. Now drawing to the thesis, these scenes demonstrate that Your Name treats memory as a more durable form of connections rather than writing or technology. While the notes and the text initially allows them to communicate across times and distance, when they fail, memory becomes the only method that continues to connect the characters and drives the story forward. In Your Name, the Twilight Meetings is the first moments when Taki and Mitsuha are physically present at the same place and time. This scene shows that even face-to-face communications can also fail. When Taki and Mitsuha finally see each other, they talk briefly, but they quickly realize that they will soon forget each other once the twilight ends. To prevent this, they try to write their names on one another's hands. However, before they could do anything, the twilight ends. The film emphasizes how close communication comes to succeeding. The camera focuses on the pens, their hands, and their faces in the close-up shots. The golden hours creates a calm and intimate atmosphere. It suggests that this is the moment where communication should work, but instead they disappear, showing the sudden loss of connections. Instead of allowing the moments to be resolved through writing, the author Shinkai structures the scenes around the sudden interruptions of the timelines. Just as the two main characters begin to write their names, the camera cuts to Taki and Mitsuha disappear from the frame, leaving Taki alone. The shift from the intimate scenes we are expecting to the sudden absence reminds us of the failure of communication itself. Importantly, this breakdown does not erase their bonds. Although they both forget each other's names, but they both retain the emotional trace of their relationships. What remains is the feelings, the moments that reinforces the movie's central ideas that communications is a fragile form of connections. Instead, Your Name proposes that memories is the only form of connections that is capable, that survives the limit of times. In the final moments of the movie, Your Name shows Takis and Misa passing each other's and immediately sensing a connection. Even though that neither can explain why, the questions, have we met before, suggest that something remains. Despite the loss of names and memories, visually, the both characters are placed at the center of the frame. The author Shinkai avoids showing one character's moving forwards or away from the others, and neither is visually prioritized through the camera's heights, focus, or framing. Instead, the scenes uses the balance, shot, reverse shot editing, giving Takis and Misaha equal screen times and avoiding the suggestions that either one remembers more than the other. The films also avoids using flashbacks, narrations, and or even visual reminders of the shared past. Rather than restoring the memories as informations, the scene shows recognitions happening without explanations, and even without names, timelines, or even written records. Takis and Mesaha recognize each other. This moments completes Your Name's central ideas is that while writings and technologies are repeatedly failed, emotional memories remains the most durable form of connections that is capable of surviving time, loss, and forgetting. Now, up to this point, Your Name shows that writings and technologies are repeatedly failed to maintain communications. The notes on the phone disappears, names are forgotten, and written communication fails as the most critical moments. Even when these systems collapse, Takis and Misaha remains connected through emotional memories. And so I'm gonna move on to A Silent Voice. A Silent Voice also asks the same questions in a different way. Words fail not because of times, but because of disability, guilt, and avoidance. Instead of text and timelines, it uses sign languages, notebooks, and visual symbols like the X marks on people's faces. Moving on to A Silent Voice, I will examine where this visual systems breaks down and how connections only begins once the character finally look at each other directly. In The Silent Voice, spoken communications is replaced through Soko's notebook. Because Soko is deaf, she uses the notebook to communicate with her classmates by writing simple greetings and questions in an attempt to participate and connect. The notebook functions as the primary method of communications when speech is not accessible. The film draws attention to the notebook through the close-up shots of the written pages. The shots with Sokos are frequently static and quiet, emphasizing the effort and the vulnerability involved in her attempts to communicate. However, the film repeatedly cuts from these close-ups to a wider shots of a classmate ignoring, mocking, or physically damaging the notebook. This contrast highlights the gaps between Soko's intentions to communicate and her peers' refusal to engage. Sound design reinforces this failure. The dialogue from her classmates is often emphasized while Soko's presence is marked by silence to emphasize her isolations. This scene shows that the alternative form of communications are fragile when they are not respected. Writing exists, but it does not create understanding because it is ignored and dismissed. A Silent Voice established that communication fails not because the tools are unavailable, but because empathy, is absence. The notebook becomes a symbol of how connections cannot
お前
form
さ
unless the
も
other
っとうまく
parties
や
are
らねえ
willing
と
to respect
うざがられ
and
ちゃうんじゃね
respond.
えの
ありがとう。
In this scene, the silent voice shows communication failing even when the characters are physically present. Because spoken language is not equally accessible, Soko is deaf and struggles to express herself through speech. Relying on the limited spoken words to communicate with Soya on the bridge. What she intends as the confession of love is unclear to him, and he misreads her words and responds awkwardly. Although speech is attempted, understanding does not occur. The scenes emphasizes separations through framing. Soko and Soya are often placed on the opposite sides of the frame, connected by the bridge but rarely sharing the same place. The medium shots and the over-the-shoulders framing keep them slightly apart, reinforcing the emotional distance even during the conversations. The cameras avoid using the close-up shots that might signal any intimacy. This suggests that Soko and Soya are not yet fully aligned. The sound design is also very deliberately
Arigato.
clear. While the background noises continues, it makes Soko's words easy to miss. The film does not clarify her meaning for the audience through subtitles or any internal narrations. Instead, the viewers experience the misunderstanding alongside with Soya, which furthermore emphasizing how easily meaning can be lost when someone fails to listen carefully. A silent voice shows that communication can fail when words are spoken. The problem is not silence, but misinterpretations. The movie suggests that alternative communications are fragile if the attention is
綺麗だ
missing.
ね。
Understanding requires more than just communications. It requires the willingness to truly
西
listen.
宮。
In the fireworks scenes, a silent voice shows communication failing not because it is impossible, but because they are not received. Soya tries to strike
こ
up
の
a
間、家に
conversation
呼んで
with
くれてあり
Soko
がと
during
う
the。fireworks.
おばさん、
He attempts to be
Mm.
present and talk with her,
喜んでた
but Soko appears to be emotionally distant and disengaged.
西宮の
The conversation does
誕生日は
not develop, and the two part ways without resolving what either of them is feeling.
じゃあ
The
また
scenes
な。
emphasizes disconnections through spacing and movements. Soya and Soko are often framed apart, sharing the same environments but not the same emotional space.
あり
The
がとう。
fireworks dominates the backgrounds, drawing attention from the interactions and reinforcing how easily communication is thrown out. After they separated, the film cuts to Soya returning home to get Soko's sister's cameras, where he notices Soko's outside the windows. Now at this point, the sound shifts dramatically. The fireworks grow louder and the tense music builds as Soya realizes something is wrong. Then the sound suddenly cuts. The abrupt stops, really highlighting the sense of dangers and marks the moments when earlier failures to communicate led to becomes this crisis. Rather than explaining Soko's minds through dialogues, the film uses the visual absence to signal her withdrawal. Soko appears to be looking for every reason to live, and notably, she does not use the familiar by hand gestures seen earlier in the scenes. The missing gestures suggest that she has stopped trying to maintain connections even through non-verbal communications. The scenes shows that once communication is no longer being received, both words and gesture lose their power, turning silence into a warning signs of deeper disconnections. In the final school festival scenes, a silent voice shows what finally allows communication to succeed.
ありがとう西宮。
Throughout the films, Soya sees a large X marks covering people's faces, signaling his avoidance and fear of social connections. During the festival, as Soya begins to engage openly with others, this X marks gradually far away. The scene shifts from having the cameras on Sawyer to the wide crowd shots. This shows that Sawyer is no longer separated from the others by distance or barriers. He is replaced amongst his classmates, surrounded by faces he can now clearly see. The camera lifts upwards as he looks around, reinforcing this change in perspective. This seems answering the film's central questions by showing that communication does not succeed through language or tool alone. Sign languages and writing speech are present throughout the film, yet they fail when the characters avoid one another. At the festival, a connection becomes possible only when Shoya stops looking away and begins to visually acknowledge others. A silent voice argues that communication finally works when the characters are willing to see and accept one another, allowing words and gestures to be received rather than ignored. Across Your Name and A Silent Voice, both movie begins with the same problems. Spoken language is unreliable or inaccessible, forcing the characters to rely on alternative forms of communication such as writing, notes, phones, sign languages, and notebooks. Through these tools, both directors shows that communications can temporarily connect people, but consistently fail at the crucial emotional moments. However, both movies ultimately arrive at different conclusions about what makes a connection possible. In Your Name, this failure is tied to time and loss, as Andrea Castiglione says. Text, notes, and messages exchanged between Takis and Mitsuha are, and I quote, abruptly fade away. And any memory fixed in writings or technology is, and I quote, doomed to disappear. Yet, the film final staircase scene shows that connections does not disappear with them. Even without names and records, Takis and Mitsuha recognize each other, confirming Castiglione's observations that they, and I quote, do not need to ask each other's names. When they meet again, Shinkai presents emotional memories as the most durable form of communications, the one that survives when all the tools fail. Your Name presents communications as something fragile in face of time and loss. When writing and technology disappears, the messages are erased, the names are forgotten. The movie suggests that emotional memories is the only connections that survives. The author, Shinkai, treats memory as something that persists above anything else. He allows connections to continue even when the characters cannot explain or remember the shared past. By contrast, A Silent Voice shows the failure of communications not in time, but in how communication is received. Spoken words, sign language, and writing are all present, yet they fail because Sawyer avoids eye contact, misreads the meaning, or refuses to fully engage. Yamada's movies argues that communications does not succeed through tools or language alone. Instead, communications becomes possible only when the character stops avoiding one another and visually recognize the other persons in front of them. In both movies, these alternative communications are tested through moments of breakdowns when the messages disappears, when the meanings are misunderstood, or the gestures that go unacknowledged. It reveals that communication fails not because the communication tools are absent, but because they cannot carry any feelings and emotion on their own. In the end, Your Name and A Silent Void shows that communications does not succeed simply because language or tools exist. The notes, phones, sign language, and writing can create some temporary connections, but they fail at the moments that matters most. Your Name shows that when communication fails, emotional memories allows a connections to continue across times. A Silent Voice shows that communications only succeeds when the character stops avoiding each other and directly recognize the person in front of them. Together, the films argues that the real communication depends not better on the tools they use, but the remains when the tools ultimately fail.